south west monsoon, until today closed down the ports of India. Operation will be impossible because of high winds and high waves. Since when did people know about this? Our first written source is the Atlas of the Erythraean Sea, notes by a Greek merchant sailor about the trade between Egypt and India and Eastern Africa. And he's talking about someone who, by observing the location of the ports and the conditions of the sea, was the first one to not cling to the coast, but directly cross the sea to India. I hope I'm unmuted again. Okay. This is a source of out of the annals of the Han, and they're talking about the trading ships of the barbarians, which took Chinese to India. The voyage would take 10 months on sea, 10 days over land, and another 2 months on sea. And for back, they'd know that the voyage could take 8 months in the Bay of Bengal and 8 months in this southern Chinese Ocean. We have the impression that the voyage was divided by 2. Let's have a look at the nautical chart again about the distance we are talking about. With an average of 2 to 3 knots, each of these legs would take something like a month. This very much fits into what Pliny tells us about the voyage from the Bab el Mandeb to southwest India, 40 days. The whole voyage from the Persian Gulf to China would take us 4 months, and that means without a stop. You cannot take on water, you cannot rest, and you will easily note that a voyage of 4 months will go beyond will take more than 2 of these circuits. So you'd have to wait for the change again. But it might take 2 years. What is the impressions of people who travel on this maritime road? Here's Faxian, a Chinese pilgrim of the 5th century, tells us about a boundless expanse of a deep and bottomless sea, where in the darkness of the night only the great waves were seen, full of monsters of the deep. The same was reported by Atisha, who traveled in the 10th century, more or less the same voyage. He and his pals get very terrified coming into a storm. And man is not a maritime animal. You note, please, this person sitting there on a ship depicted on the Borobudur. This guy is really miserable. I suppose he is seasick. All our reporters tell us that the sailors found their way by observing the sun, the moon, and the stars. There's a reason for that. On board of a ship, you can see something like 3 to 5 nautical miles into any direction, and everything you would be behind the horizon. Only after traveling a considerable distance, you'd see the first signs of your destination. What is mentioned most often is stars. We have a problem with stars. They rise every day 4 minutes earlier than the day before. So here the stars on the 7th September of 2007 at 10 o'clock are completely different to the stars at the same time on the 7th May of 2007. Not one star is repeated. In the north, or in the northern hemisphere, we happily have Polaris. Here seen in Mumbai on 15th September of 2020, quarter to 11. And if you go to March, all the other stars changed, but Polaris is still where it was. And actually at the same height above the horizon. We move south to Kochi, and Polaris will be lower down on the horizon, but still in the same bearing, nearly north. This star you can use to find your way on sea with this Akama. It's a small board of wood which you place onto the horizon, and then above it would see the star. you are aiming at the North Star. And by making knots into there, you could note various heights of the North Star. If you, for example, would know the height of Mumbai and the height of Kochi, you could use this to find the latitude of your sailing. This is what our anonymous Greek sailor tells us about Hippalos, who, by observing the location of the ports and the condition of the sea, found the way to India, the direct way. In the south, we have a problem. There is no Polaris. You have to look for other stars. Here's one example. A part of Western terminology is called Orion, and it will rise above the zenith in just the same angle. So we can use the 4 points it points to as a kind of compass. Another one, rather famous, is the Southern Cross. Drawing lines through the Southern Cross will always end up somewhere on the south, on your horizon. And there is something else. Here we are sailing to the east at night, and if you know certain stars, it would seem that they rise behind your destination. This is called star path navigation, something that is extensively reported being used by Pacific navigators. And believe me, you can use it still today. You look at your compass and pick a star out on the horizon and follow that. After some time, you look at your compass again and take another star which is still on the bearing you want to go to. How would that go in practice? Here's an Anantiribon wreck sailing with the west monsoon, the Indonesian west monsoon, September to April, and then sinking in the middle of the Java Sea. They were on a course of about 130 degrees. If we extend that course, we end up close to Semarang. And was found a considerable amount of ceramics of just more or less the same shape of what was in the ship itself. We would believe that he actually was on the course he was sailing to. If you have a compass, you follow this red line on your compass. If you want to use a star, you have to position 30 degrees on the horizon. This is the night of the 25th December of 1999. About the time I'd imagine the ship would be sailing. And you see two stars in there now, in Suhail al-Muflih, followed by al-Suhail, and a procession of other stars which rise in the small reddish corner down there until the next morning. This is what we call a star path, which can lead you more or less into where you want to go, in this case, Semarang, where after some time you'd see the mountain, which is behind it, and can make a landfall. I'd imagine that our friends Hippalos, the barbarian sailors who carried the Chinese ambassadors to India, or Captain Abara and Buzur, well knew about any kind of navigation that way. In 724, the Tang dynasty sent some astronomer royals to Hanoi to make observations. On their way down to the south, they found numerous stars of which they hadn't heard about. By the 11th century, Chinese used compasses. Where did these people sail to with all that knowledge? Here's Zheng He's voyages of the 15th century, which apparently became the epitome of the Maritime Silk Road, which is being promoted lately. This is a world map made by Indian Mauro, and on this small corner, which is a small reddish quadrant which just vanished, he reports about a ship which in 1420 sailed from India to a place, Cape Diab, and then from there for 40 days out into the open ocean to the southwest, else than wind and water. This ship was called a Choncho, very probably an Italian way to pronounce Junco or Jonco, until the 17th century designated Jong, the largest of the insular Southeast Asian ships. We have a problem with Famau's map. It's south atop. So we actually are looking at this corner, which would be the Southern Africa. In his text 149, we hear more. They sailed beyond the Cape of Sofala. That locals on board, people who knew about the stars, told them that they had been sailing 2,000 miles to the southwest. in 1420 on an insular Southeast Asian vessel. They found nothing other than wind and water. This is Zheng He's voyages, and I'd imagine that the Cape of Good Hope was the southwestern terminus of Asia's maritime connections. It was only broken by the Portuguese 2 generations later when Bartolomeu Diaz passed the Cape. With the Portuguese came conquerors, but just the same came people who wrote things, so we do have more sources. Here's Alfonso de Albuquerque, where he mentions a chart he got found on a Sumatran ship, which he took, which showed the Cape of Good Hope. A copy of that chart was used by Abreu when he sailed to Banda, one of the Spice Islands, very probably the southeastern corner of our maritime connection. Ludovico de Bartema, an Italian traveler in 1505, sailed on a jonk, a true Malay jonk from Brunei to Java, and he reports the same. The captain of his ship had a chart and a compass, and he used stars opposite to the North Star. Talking about map, here's another non-European map, probably based on a Ptolemaic picture of the world, made in the 12th century by an Arab in Arab for one of the Norman kings of Sicily. Again, our map is south of the top, and this would be our Indian Ocean on that map. We have Al Ramni, a place in Sumatra. We have Java, probably Java. We have a Malay Peninsula. We have China, India, and Africa. It's not only a map what Al-Idrisi made, it's a kind of what happens in the various parts and climates he is talking about. Here in part 8 of Climate 1, he's talking about the people of Sabaj, which came to Sofala to collect iron ore for the production of Indian wood steel. Sabaj or Sabak is an Arab name for Sumatra or Java. He repeats more or less the same in Sector 7 and adds onto it Sribusa, the Arab name for Sriwijaya, the maritime polity in Sumatra and the Malacca Straits. In Sector 9, he repeats the same about people from Madagascar and the merchants of Sriwijaya who come to Sofala and trade there. Apparently, in the 12th century, a Sicilian Arab would know about this voyage. Let us return to Buzurg in the 10th century, talking about 1,000 ships coming to Kampalu and Pemba, Zanzibar, looking for trade goods for China. The islands of Avak, where they came from, are opposite to China. The voyage takes about a year. Supposedly, we again are talking about people from somewhere in insular Southeast Asia who traveled the whole expanse of the Indian Ocean. How could Buzurg know about it? Already in the 8th century, it is well known that Persian traders went to Eastern Africa. It would seem in the footsteps of our Greek sailors, who in the 1st century already know about a lot of places all the way down to the Zanzibar archipelago. You'd think that to be anecdotal. However, the notion we have about expeditions to East Africa come from a mid-9th century manuscript written by a Sudanese, or probably what today is Kenyan, slave living in Baghdad. And we have hard data, linguistic and genetic ones, which note that at least by the 5th century, people from Southeast Asia were settling in Madagascar. Let's go to the ships they did it on, the trading ships of the barbarians, which had taken the ambassadors of the Han to India. Greek, just the same, know about the ships called Colandia Fonta, which come from Crete, the Malay Peninsula, and sail to the Ganges. These ships are the largest of all the ships sailing in the ocean. And that just the same is repeated in Chinese sources. The Kunlun Bo, 700 people, up to 1,000 is merchandise we hear in the 3rd century. What do we know about these ships? Here's a number of movers from India. And we can compare quite much of these ships with the first proper drawings we have from the Dutch expedition to Indonesia. There's one difference, however, the sails. The sails drawn by the Dutch are just the same as the sails being depicted on the Borobudur, or still being used in the 19th century in the eastern part of the Malay archipelago. How reliable are these representations? It is surprising that the reliefs on the Borobudur depict a very clear picture of the rigging of these ships, including most of the necessary ropes, lines, which handle the sails. A cry from our Indian movers. The ships on the Borobudur show us something else, outriggers, which are not found on 19th century or 16th century vessels. For outriggers, we have to go through this, the Austronesian migration. Migration of people using Austronesian languages, which became the largest of maritime movement of people. And the distribution, the eventual distribution of Austronesian languages very closely fits into the distribution of outrigger craft. It would seem that these, the outriggers, might have been man's first truly seaworthy vessel, being used already 5,000 years ago. What does archaeology tell us about these vessels? The oldest find, as far as I know, still is the Pontian wreck, dating into somewhere between the 3rd and the 5th century, and being reconstructed like that. All these planks lying there apparently were connected. And they were connected by once by wooden dowels, plus an addition of ropes stitched through these small holes made there. What do we know about the use of dowels? In the 10th century, Southeast Asian ships used them, and only dowels. And they're still being used for shipbuilding all over the eastern parts of the Malay archipelago. Stitchings are something different. Here's a find from Thailand of the 9th century, which actually is not a Thai ship. Ah yeah, there's a difference between stitchings and sewn. The stitching rope would not be continuous, while the other ones are continuous. This is called the Arabian Sea tradition. It's an Indian, Arab, or Persian technology, and it was just the same, used all the way down to the 20th century. What else can we know from archaeology? Here's Indonesia's oldest ship, as it's called, 6th or 7th century. And you see on the planks these small, lugs they are called, these small boxes, which are just the same with the Cirebon wreck. By now we have something like about a dozen finds of ships, or remains of ships, where these small lugs are spared out on the side of the planks. And there are holes in these lugs, which, as we see here in Sito on the Punjul Hata wreck, are used to tie the frames of the ship onto them, the ribs of the ship. Here we see them in the Nanan Cirebon wreck, displaced, but there's still a rope, and this is a reconstruction of the Pontian wreck. It would schematically look like this. You have lashings holding the frames of the ship onto the planks. And this is called the Lashed-Lug technique. It's a major characteristic of Western Austronesian boat building. These lugs we call tambuku because they're called like that in most of the Austronesian language. How do you do them? You take a piece of timber, cut it into two, cut them out, turn them around, and you have two symmetrical planks which can be placed on starboard and port side of the hull. These symmetries are used for very complex ways of building ships. Not only the 10th century, but until into the 20th century. Here, a plank pattern from Sulawesi, where the tambugu not only mark the length of planks, but also the frames, the position of all the dowels being used in the system. Where do they come from? Here's perhaps what is, the real first ship-style thing man invented, the dugout. The ethnographic record shows that while doing a dugout, people tend to leave these thwarts in there. They could use them, or you can use them to tie outrigger beams onto them with lashings. There's a problem about that. This is the grain of the timber, and as soon as the outrigger beam starts to move, the grain will tend to break. So you're left with small pieces on the inside of the dugout, under which you could easily tie another piece of timber or bamboo and thus fix your outrigger. You add a wash strake and you have a much better ship. If you leave the same kind of lugs on the wash strake, you have ample possibilities to fix the whole ship together. And this is found in the ethnographic record, all the way from Eastern Indonesia throughout the Pacific to Hawaii. This apparently is a very long tradition, which leads us over more than 3,000 years. You will have not heard anything about Chinese ships yet. They have a completely different way of building them. There would be bulwarks, it's this kind of wall inside the hull, and planks would be fastened with metal nails and clamps. The archaeological record of the first millennium does not note Chinese ships. As far as I know, the only other shipwreck finds in the whole expanse between China and Africa are some Greco-Egyptian vessels which were found in the Red Sea. In China, we find just the same. Well into the Song, all remains dated well into the Song dynasty are for river transportation, coastal transportation ships. The famous Nanhai One wreck is from the 12th or 13th century. And we have another, this is Chinese ships. They would be in northern China flat-bottomed. This different to the ships of Arabs or Indonesian ships, which have a V shape. If they are V-shaped and are built on a keel, they have a shallow draft, height. And they carry central rudders. Central rudders were adopted by the Arab, Persian, and Indian sailors, but not in the Malay archipelago. And we have another problem with Chinese ships. The first half of the second millennium developed this one, the Southeast Asian, the South China Sea tradition, using bulwarks, but just the same, having wooden dowels to connect the planks. And we have a date about when these ships came into usage, very probably with the Yuan, which went for an attack on Java in 1293. Let's add them onto the chart. Then the first half of the second millennium, there are some finds again of Lashed-Lug and dowel ships. But our Chinese ships are mainly concentrated in China. There's one find in the Paracel Islands and one rather unclear off the Cambodian coast, and they all are rather late. As I said, to the best of my knowledge, we do as yet have not any early find of a Chinese ship in at least the Malay archipelago. There's an unknown wrecks, or where the information is not good enough. So we'll have to wait for something like that. The Chinese brought something else, the Lashed-Lug sails, a rather efficient way of sailing, but it was not adopted in the Malay Archipelago or the Indian Ocean. But it made its way all through the South China Sea and the Peninsula. We had one part of this drawing already. It's a drawing of what the Dutch saw on their first voyage coming into the Java Sea. We have a ship here like the ones on the Borobudur. We have another one with outriggers. And we have one with the Chinese Lashed-Lug sail. But all of them carry later rudders which are fixed onto the side of the ship and not in the center line of the hull. The one here would be the Jong, the largest of the many types of insular ships. This probably might be a Jong Sasana, as we had it in the Japanese manuscript. This is the extent of Zheng He's voyages. We meanwhile have heard of other voyages well before the 12th century, before Chinese influence on the shipbuilding technology of the area. Why did people? Here's a cargo of the Nanhan sea-borne vessel. It has to do with trade. You want to take goods to a place where these are not available and sell them. We so often hear that there were hundreds, if not thousands, of these ships plying the seas of Asia. So let's give that a test. The main cargo of the Nanhan sea-borne vessel was Chinese ceramics, some 500,000 to 600,000 of them, and they were heading for Central and Eastern Java. Happily, we do have records by the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, about how many ceramics were imported into Java. Ceramics were a monopoly of the company, so they recorded what went in and out of the port. There is 3 ports where we have no data for. Those I just gave an average of the other ports. These figures should be seen as indications because the Dutch were always arguing about smuggling. So let's add 20% of unrecorded imports coming from perhaps Banjarmasin, maybe Makassar, which were not recorded by the Dutch. We end up with 350,000 pieces market demand for ceramics in the late 18th century for a population of 3 to 5 million people. It is generally assumed that population density in Southeast Asia, in insular Southeast Asia, didn't change much. So we'll use that number. This is 3 further wreck finds and the number of ceramics they carried. This would be our demand for ceramics in Java. You'd easily see that the one Nanhan sea-borne ship would supply more than the yearly demand. Must be something wrong. We take the average, we end up with something between 1 and 2.5 voyages per year, which could supply the whole demand for ceramics for Java. The people of Java of the 18th century were Muslim. Here is a piece of from the Nanhan sea-borne wreck compared to censers which I've seen in Malaysia being used for Buddhist ceremonial usage. In Hinduism, you just the same would need bowls for offerings to the gods. And just the same in Malaysia, we find these bowls being sold, for example, here in Malacca, and they're produced in Selangor. They don't look much to the more than 80,000 of these bowls being found on the Nanhan sea-borne wreck. So let us just assume double numbers for ceremonial use for ceramics. We just the same end up with not a high amount of voyages. And if you just look at the Nanhan sea-borne wreck, that one ship was still enough to supply all the ceramics for Eastern and Central Java for 1 year. there's a tradition of using ceramics in as grave goods in Eastern Indonesia. Let us assume these numbers, which would mean that everybody dying in Eastern Indonesia would get at least 5 pieces of ceramics in his grave. We look at population numbers, and again, the Nannan Cirebon wreck would have done 2 voyages, and all demand for ceramics would have been satisfied. For the average, we end up with this. You should keep in mind that this is based on really inflated numbers of population, demand, as well as the demand for grave goods. This would mean every grave, even in the center of the island of Seram, would be supplied with 5 ceramics. Do we have other information about the volume of trade? Here's a source from the 13th century. He's talking about 70 to 80 ships per year coming into Aden, one of the termini of the Indian Ocean trade. This would just the same include coastal traffic to Persia and the Eastern African coast. For the 8th century, we have a note from Guangzhou. In a really booming year, more than 40 ships came. In the other years, it was less. A note by Buzurg. In about the middle of the 10th century, the loss of 3 from Siraf. The loss of officers, captains, and well-known merchants was enough to contribute considerably to the decline of the ports of Siraf and Saimur. We have met some of these people, the captains and merchants, Hipalos, Kepnabara, or barbarian sailors. The Chinese sources mention some more. Here's Li Hemo of the 10th century. Here's Li Hemo. He comes for Kui, Sriwijaya. There is a private trader from Sriwijaya. And actually there's some guy called Puya Duoli. He represents both Sriwijaya and the Middle East. Where did these ships go to? In 1511, the Portuguese conquered Malacca, one of the major marts of the, whatever you want to call it, the silk, ceramics, or spice road. In 1513, Javanese and Malay fleet tried to retake Malacca. They had 35 big ships, more than 500 tons of cargo capacity, 70 smaller ones, but just in chance, a small Portuguese fleet came along with heavy artillery and sank most of them. This was repeated 3 or 4 further times. And by 1515, we hear that the governor of India had burned and defeated all enemy ships, and there was none left. The same happened in India, and the same happened to the Persians and the Arabs. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Horst, for a really extensive survey of the Maritime Silk Road, and particularly how it was sailed and by who it was sailed, and the different types of ship technology and so forth. Really fascinating discussion. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Natalie. She's going to act as respondent tonight. We've got about another 25, 30 minutes to have a discussion. So Natalie, I'll let you start off. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Horst. That was fantastic. What a PowerPoint. Horst, I always enjoy your PowerPoint presentations, particularly the animations, but the level of detail in the one tonight was unsurpassed. So thank you for spending so much time putting together a really fantastic presentation for us. Everything that you shared with us tonight usually gets wrapped up in introductions to the Maritime Silk Road. So it's really exciting to be spending some time thinking about the detail of the mechanics of how this so-called Silk Road functioned, about the climate, about the environment, what it was like to be on one of these boats, and how they actually worked. So I guess that brings me to the first thing that I want to draw your attention to all our listeners and the people who've dialed in tonight, and that is this idea of mechanics and technologies. So Horst started with this idea that there are no roads on the sea, that roads are things that connect two termini. But that was not the case, because this was a maritime landscape where, as Feixian says, the sea was this boundless expanse. It was deep and bottomless. And the only thing that you could see in the middle of the night were the waves crashing down on your boat. It was a place where ports were forced to close due to dangerous conditions, where big cyclones and even bigger typhoons could send your ship to the bottom of the sea. It was dangerous, and to embark on one of these voyages and return was quite exceptional. If you travelled across the Indian Ocean, you might not return. The voyages took months, if not years, if you were lucky enough to return. And so to be able to make these journeys successfully, you needed knowledge of things like the rhythm of the monsoon and its relationship with the currents. And you needed to know about the sun and the moon, and particularly the stars. And Horst, you introduced us to this wonderful idea of the star path, and your animations in that section were really fantastic. I think they really conveyed the complexity of what those early navigators were able to work with. And you introduced us to the Kamal, this navigational technology using string and wood and a human body. And you showed us just how skilled those navigators must have been to travel, particularly in the southern latitudes where Polaris was not easily visible, or not visible at all once you pass Sri Lanka. And to be able to navigate to places that they wanted to go to and you know, end up at the right spot. So you also explained to us how these ships were constructed and how these construction techniques can be ways of telling where a ship was made. So we saw the dowels and the stitching on the Pontian wreck, and these are still in use in South Sulawesi today, where you're calling in from, Horst. You see the sewn hull vessels that make up the Arabian Sea tradition, like the Belitung, which didn't get a mention tonight, but that's the one that my podcast is about. So thanks for the shout out there, Stephen. I will share that link if you're interested in hearing more about the Belitung, the stitch of the sewn hull technique. And you also talked about the Lashed-Lug technique, which is a major characteristic of Western Austronesian boat building. And then you introduced us to what Michael Flecker has described as the South China Sea tradition, which came later and which showed this intermingling of technologies. So bulwarks and nails from China and dowels and timbers from Southeast Asia. But you left us with this really, this sort of provocation that there's no archaeological proof of ocean-going Chinese ships before the 11th century. So there were river vessels, but no ocean-going vessels. And this might be something that we come back to in the discussion. The other thing you've done with your talk, in addition to mechanics and technologies, is you've really shown us the value of multidisciplinary approaches to studying the past. So one of the things I love about your presentation is how many sources you've drawn on. You've looked at inscriptions and text. You've got that engraving from Borobudur in which you picked out the sails and the outriggers. And maybe something that I would like to come back to is the little figure that you drew our attention to, who appeared to be seasick. But maybe there's another interpretation there. Maybe this little figure was praying. Maybe they were praying because they were seasick. So I'd really like to explore that later, because I know Himanshu Prabha Ray, who I think is calling in tonight, has this idea of coastal shrines, and the ability of people to pray on board was quite limited using objects, but you know, there were recitations and prayers that could take place in a small contained environment like a vessel. So maybe just something to come back to. You also draw on the accounts of lots of people. I mentioned Feixian, you've got Atisha, and they all describe these voyages as terrifying. You've drawn on the Periplus of Eritrea, of course, and on people like Captain Abara and Buzug. You showed us what archaeology reveals with these wonderful examples of the Punjul Hajo and the Chirabon and other shipwrecks from the region. And you also drew on iconography with images and illustrations and maps, and of course language in your discussion about Tambuku and the spread of language through outrigger craft. On top of all this, if you don't know of Horst, you might not know that he's a very experienced sailor. And so what he's done is he's brought his own experience at sea. And I think that really brings a very unique perspective to what is already a fantastically multidisciplinary approach. And what it allows you to do is to calculate, as you did, the bearing of the Turabon wreck, which is a wreck that you've done a lot of work on, of course, and allow us to work backwards using its bearing to determine the day that it might have wrecked in the 10th century, which is quite astonishing. And there might also be the opportunity later to talk about, in addition to these iconographic and archaeological sources and text, it'd be great to come back and explore further the role of experimental archaeology in informing how we understand the mechanics of the Silk Road and the fantastic ship reconstructions that we've seen in Indonesia and also in Oman with people like Tom Vosma and Nick Birmingham. And finally, you've left us with this tantalizing and really important idea that while we celebrate Zheng He's voyages of the 15th century, which sort of epitomised the Maritime Silk Road, there is extensive evidence that Southeast Asians, Austronesians, Persians, Arabs, Indians were all making these voyages hundreds of years earlier, well before there was any Chinese influence on the boat building technology. And in fact, you made the claim, which some of our audience might be interested in pursuing, that there is not even any evidence of any genuine Chinese ships in the South China Sea before, I think, the 11th or the 12th century. So when we're talking about the Maritime Silk Road and its modern successor, the Belt and Road Initiative, it is really so important to have this at the forefront of our mind because the discourse is so Sino-centric. But Horst, what you've done is to help us recenter Southeast Asia into our considerations of maritime histories and technologies before the arrival of the Europeans in the 16th century, and in fact, well before Zheng He's fabled voyages. So I think I'll leave it there, but I've got a couple of questions I'd like to explore, and maybe we could come back to some of those points I raised just now. Thank you.
Thanks, Natalie. That's a very excellent summary. Horst, do you want to address any of those points right now, or will we take some questions? You're muted, Horst. You're muted. There you go. You've muted yourself again. Oh.
Yeah, one thing that really should have been there was this idea about silk. It's called the Maritime Silk Road, isn't it? I already thought that John Guy should be talking about that, and I guess he will. Just the same as with the ships. The production of silk already by the end of the first millennium was not a Chinese monopoly. We had it in the Byzantine Empire. There was Persian silk and Indian silk at that time. And silk was not really, as far as we know from records by the East India companies, the main, or Chinese silk was the main product being carried in terms of cloth. Clothes from India were much more important than those from China. There is something which, yeah, as Natalie said, the Belt and Road Initiative, which we should see perhaps a little bit more diplomatic from the non-Chinese side of it. The great Malay, Persian, Arab traders were kicked out of their business by the Dutch East India, by the Portuguese and the English. We should learn from that, I believe, for what is going to happen with the Belt and Road Initiative. But then, Natalie, please pick out some of the questions people put up there.
Sure, let me go through. There's quite a few. Natalie, you want to respond first?
Well, I actually have one question of my own, which I would like to, I'm getting noticed.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Which I would like to raise, and that is, and some of these questions I suppose are coming through the chat, and it's this idea of the loss of the objects in the ship and the sort of, you know, all the commodities, the silk, the ceramics, whatever it was that was on board, the trade that sort of was interrupted by the shipwreck. But one of the things you talked about so much was the skills of the people involved in putting these vessels to sea, building them and then navigating them, the captains, the pilots, the navigators, and the shipwrights as well on land. So if these ships are going down with navigators and captains on board, what are the consequences there in terms of the loss of knowledge. You said that there weren't that many voyages taking place. So what does that tell us about the loss of these people and the loss of those skills in terms of navigation and also boat building?
Yeah, Natalie, I guess your question is self-answering. And we had that last, in one of the last slides, the quote by Buzurg, where he says, the loss of only 3 ships and all the people aboard was a major disaster for 2 of the main ports of the Indian Ocean. And it is more than trade, it is not only trade. When thinking about this presentation, I thought about the relation between those skillful people, the captains, the boat builders, and local authority, or any kind of authority. We have quite a number of notes about captains being very, very received by the kings and queens of their times. There was one which I didn't mention here because it's a little tricky whether it's true or not. It's about a Persian trader who is in Baros, trading for camphor, and then he is called to the court of Srivijaya. He spends several months and becomes a big pal of the Maharaja. At the moment, the Maharaja wants to go and attack maybe Eastern Africa, maybe Java. He has to leave everything behind which is not transportable for his retinue for the upcoming attack. And it should have been said in the text. The Maharaja of Sribusa decides that he gives all these goods to our Persian trader. In only some months, a captain of a ship became such a big friend with one of the most powerful persons in the Eastern Sea, that he would take away all what the Maharaja could not carry with him. We have other notes, Persian traders conferring with the emperors of China. And we had the people personally as I showed on one of the last slides, their names in the records. I imagine that this is something that has to be explored much. A very good example of such research would be the role of a certain Portuguese trader in Makassar, who had his fingers in big money deals and big political deals. Him losing a ship going to Timor, on which the Makassar had invested money, was one of the reasons of the war of the POC against Makassar. We in this case are looking at very, very precise people. We should not forget that, for example, America is so closely connected, or let's say America in that sense, with Christopher Columbus. Opening the trade to India would be Bartolomeo Diaz and Vasco da Gama. These are people, very precise people. At the moment, we lose them because the ships sink or they get destroyed by other powers. We not only lose their knowledge, of which they wouldn't with other people, we just the same lose quite some of the political and economic networks they had built up. In this COVID crisis, we have several of our great entrepreneurs talking about what they are going to do about it. We lose one of these, probably lose some part of the vaccines we need to get along with this crisis. I imagine it wouldn't have been much different in the first millennium.
All right. Yeah, thank you, Horst. It is an interesting question, right? And not just, I guess people usually focus on the material loss of shipwrecks and the financial loss, but I think what both of you have, of course, been getting at here is the human losses, and that loss of knowledge is maybe just as much or even more of detrimental. Okay, let's take a few of the questions because time is moving on. There's one from Professor Fred Lockwood. Is there any evidence for a direct maritime route between China and the Seychelles, Madagascar during the Tang dynasty, perhaps aided by the northeast monsoon winds? I'm aware that ocean-going dhows travel vast distances and could presumably complete the return coastal journey back to China. Horst, you any?
Yeah, archaeology doesn't show us until now Chinese ships of the first millennium traveling on the open sea. Sure.
But maybe not Chinese ships per se. I think he's just talking about trade between the Seychelles and China. But,
trade there would have been, for sure.
yeah.
But probably not on Chinese ships.
Do we have much, I'm not sure, do you know offhand, but do we have much like archaeological evidence from the Seychelles, like in terms of the pottery record? Because usually, you know, in Southeast Asia, definitely in the 9th century, we see, you know, quite a bit of Southeast Asia or Tang period ceramic turning up at archaeological sites. I wonder, do we see the same type of thing in the Seychelles and Madagascar?
I do not know much about the Seychelles. What is known in the Maldives, we find boat building technology very comparable to the Southeast Asian one. Just the same here about, let's say, Ibn Battuta coming to the Maldives and having quite a position there for a year or so as a judge and a friend of the local ruler. I'd imagine that the Seychelles would just the same be connected into their trade. And there is, which is, people believe it to be a little bit of strange, the role of cowrie shells all over the Indian Ocean as a kind of money, which I guess would be easily collected on the Seychelles. To be involved in trade, you need a product. It could either, let's say, the Roman Greco trade did money to buy something, or something else to sell, to exchange against the goods you want to have. With cowries, yes, you have a good chance to these purposes.
Right. There's one or two questions about the ceramics. I think I'll ask them both at once. So Bebeo asks, you know, wouldn't a lot of ceramics get damaged during the trips and therefore require more trips? And then there's a similar question from Jagatisan, which I quite like as well. Any idea how much these ceramics cost to the local people? Maybe it's hard to get exact, but were they bought by all levels of the community as well? So that's getting at interesting questions as well, because, you know, who is the actual market, and is there, you know, if we think of the Tang shipwreck, for example, there's different levels of ceramic on that as well, right? There's the Changsha bowls that are quite, I guess, lower value. I presume they would still be expensive enough to purchase, but then you have, like, you know, the whitewares and the greenwares and so forth, which must have been, you know, much more expensive when they hit these foreign markets. So what's your take on that, Horst? Maybe in a Japanese context to narrow it down.
We can take it all over the Indian Ocean.
Yeah, we could do that if you
product. If you have much of a product, the price will not be overly expensive.
And actually the volumes you were showing are quite phenomenal from the Jeroboam wreck, for example. So but other ships carried 100,000, 200,000. This is just the same, quite a lot. What I saw on the Jeroboam wreck is that we have a big mass of something like, at least from the ones we know about, which is something like 120,000. Of those, something like 100,000 would be just very simple boats, which with not much on them and more or less the same kind of form, the muesli bowl of the 10th century. And the real high class, sophisticatedly worked with incisions and so forth, wares which were there, were probably not more
than 5,000 to 6,000.
Mm,
So
yeah.
these are expensive. They surely were used for representation. But the normal bowl, as it was probably not overly expensive because there were so many. And secondly, not something being, how should I say, at least in the Southeast Asian context, something that was overly, China wasn't far away. Been traded by that time for at least 300 years, maybe 400 years. That might be different, let's say, in Baghdad, in the Middle East,
Right.
where numbers would be something like in the tens of thousands of ceramics arriving. But even there, tens of thousands of ceramics in the port would still deflate the price. They only become expensive if they are either something very artistic or they are small numbers like the white bears. I try to check prices, but it's very difficult to compare what people say about ceramics, and it's very, very rare that people say something about them being sold or so. It's very difficult to compare what they say with what our today's prices would be. I just the same imagine it like, call it one of the Indonesian markets, where what is sold is mainly cloth, jeans, t-shirt, plus crockery, plasticware, what you need for your kitchen. Ceramics do have, at least one thing that made them so attractive, that is their durability. There was a question about breaking them. I do have one here, which is actually from the web. It has a crack, but it didn't break for 1,000 years, sinking and being carried then from the site to Jakarta and then being carried around in suitcases, whatever, until it arrived here on my desk in Makassar. They're durable, and so on one hand, they wouldn't break so easily, but secondly, you ask yourself, when did you buy your last mug, ceramic mug for coffee? If there is not much demand, but lots of that stuff, the price couldn't be overly high. It becomes, as soon as we are talking about things for representation. And there, as still today on the antique markets, very nice blue and white Ming fetches high prices. But one of these simple, let's say, green bowls, you can sell them as old as they are, and Chinese ceramic and all. You can sell them for, you can buy them in Jakarta for something like, give it $10, still today.
Can I jump in on this question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Breakage as well. You know, the alternative was transporting them on camel or horseback by the road. And of course, many more breakages that way, and much smaller quantities as well, because they were heavy and big and bulky. So, you know, we're talking about technologies. One of the beautiful things in the display at the ACM with the tongue shipwreck is the way the changsha bowls are displayed as they would have been packed in the 9th century. And they were stored inside these big storage jars, coiled helically, and then there was like a sort of organic bubble wrap around them, like, I don't know what it would have been, straw or mung bean or something. And they really protected them during the voyage, during the, you know, the waves and the winds and all that sort of thing, but also upon impact with the reef, the seabed, and then as the shipwreck falls apart. And this is something Michael Flecker sort of explained to me just very recently, that there are different stages of breakages with the ceramics, with the initial wrecking, then when the ship hits the bottom of the ocean floor, and then over the ensuing decades as the ship falls apart and disintegrates, that's when more breakage occurs. But one of the amazing things about the changsha bowls in the Belitung, the tongue collection, is that they were so, some of them were so beautifully preserved that when they went to, I think it was John Guy at the V&A, he said that the glaze on them was still gleaming, and it was almost like they were fake. I mean, they're over 1,000 years old by that point, and they've been so beautifully packed, so sophisticated with these packing techniques that they still look like this after so long submerged in organic bubble wrap, so to speak.
Yeah, John is tuned in actually. He joined us about 25 minutes ago. So, John, you've been mentioned twice already. So yeah, I definitely have to. There he is. I definitely have to organise that date for you, John.
Oh, you're
John,
on mute.
You're on mute, John. If you wanted.
Still on mute.
John, you're on mute. You need to unmute yourself.
Oh.
Or maybe I can do it for him. Oh.
So maybe while you unmute yourself, I could add the East India companies placed the better ceramics into.
Oh, here we go. Hi, John. Hello.
You're referring to my earlier avatar at the V&A, I saw within a few weeks, I believe, of when the Changsha material was first appearing on the market in Jakarta and Jalan Surabaya, the examples of these Changsha wares appeared in London, brought in to be shown to me, and yes, I'd seen many hundreds of shards of this sort of material over the decades preceding, and these were in such pristine condition. One's first reaction would say, well, it's clearly these are very, very skilled reproductions. And of course, when you post the scrutiny, it was very clear that they were genuine, and what we were looking at was something quite astonishing in terms of that cargo as it emerged over the following year or so. So yes, that's funny you should remember that anecdote.
Oh, well, I've written my PhD about that shipwreck, so yes. Can I just add one more thing about this? Sorry, Horst, I know you were mid-sentence, but this idea of flooding the market and the value of the bowls. So when the Tongue shipwreck was salvaged and the commercial salvage company was looking to sell it, there was this sort of quandary. Do we allow private collectors and museums to cherry pick the best objects, like the oversized ewer and the gold cup? Or do we try and sell it as a single assemblage? And they were very committed to trying to sell it together. But there were also economic benefits in keeping the assemblage together, because if you flood the market with 55,000 Changsha bowls, you know, it's much more valuable actually to keep it, particularly in an assemblage that's got so many multi-duplicate ceramics. It's much more valuable to keep it together. And thank goodness it was, because it's this incredible scholarly resource now. But I think in those early days when they were estimating the value, I think Sotheby's and Christie's estimated the value of the bowls at about between $3 to $5 per bowl. Yeah.
They're a lot more valuable now if you talking about market demand and provenance. But yes, that's a discussion maybe for another day.
And it's important. And listen, if you see those things on the market in the antique shops of Jakarta, you shouldn't be buying them.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's encouraging looting and salvaging. So that's really important.
I think we should all make that clear. Yeah, that it's. But Horst, I don't know if any follow up on that, or we might take one more question and then we'll call it a day.
Yeah, the one thing was about the tea where the Europeans transported the ceramics in, so they wouldn't break. On shipborne wreck, they were just in long, what should I say, they were packed one in another. And apparently there was some leaves around it or so, some leaves in between. But they weren't packed overly, at least not the very common ones, they weren't packed overly carefully. There is a big find, I guess it is off Semarang or somewhere in Eastern Java, where there is lots and lots and lots of broken ceramics on the sea. Apparently, it had to do with the loading and unloading. On the ship itself, ceramics wouldn't break so easily. Your main problem would be the loading and unloading. That's where you...
Yeah, that's a good point. And I guess that's why we see at these sort of port areas, even in the archaeological record, then maybe that's, I guess, what
like in Guangzhou we had that.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, great. Let's just take one more question. I guess a few people are still asking about Chinese ships. That's something that does interest people. One is like, okay, Abba Kal asks, you know, what do we know about these Chinese ships? Where were they going? And what did they carry? Where were the wrecks found? I think you sort of addressed that to a certain extent. Then Hans van der Bunt asks, can we conclude or assume from the lack of Chinese ships wrecks found that Southeast Asian sailors with their own ships transported and sold Chinese products further to Africa, Middle East, and Europe. So again, I guess that's a related question, you know, where, well, yeah, who's shipping what where, and where does who's got the monopoly in some ways. And then a follow-up question, the role of Borneo, that's an interesting question as well, particularly in the 10th to 12th century. So maybe we could just wrap up with that, Horst, if you want to just say a few things about that, and then we'll call it a night.
At the start of the presentation, I tried to show how far the wind can take you in 1 year. As Natalie already said, you want to do the whole trip from Persia to China. You're facing a major risk. Captain Abara was the first, they said, the voyage back and forth without a mishap. And Buzok tells us a very funny story about Captain Abara being stranded somewhere in the Paracel Islands. Though he did the 7 voyages, he still lost his ship somewhere. Happily, he was rescued, all the rest died, as the story goes. It is much more safe to do one of the possible voyages in 1 year. You would go from China to Sumatra, for example. That is easily done. It takes you something like a month or 2, and you have time enough to refit your ship, to trade, to sell, and go back next year to China. You just the same wouldn't need so much knowledge about sea lanes. Where are the reefs? What is the wind? What could happen here? What could happen there? So any kind of major trade, like say in ceramics with big investments, in my personal opinion, wouldn't go much further than at the very best 2 of these. We'd have a lot of trade between Persia and India, between Arabia and India. We'd have a lot of trade between Persia and Eastern Africa. And whatever you carry to one of the ports on these routes could be recarried by another ship to another port. And you wouldn't risk overly much in terms of life and in terms of loss of investment. You can sell your stuff, let's say, in Baghdad, after you took it from India, and they are in Siraf, and they then take it down to Malindi. So you concentrate on what you're doing. The idea of the Persians doing all the trip must have had to do with high difference in prices of certain very small objects they could carry. We were talking about silk. One of the most expensive silks being sold in Amsterdam in the 17th century were the kimono given by the Emperor of Japan to the Dutch trading company. They each year got something like 10 or so. And those were taken to Amsterdam all the way. And they were sold there for very, very high prices. This is something to make money with. This is something where you would risk something of. I hope that first part of the question. The question about Borneo, Kalimantan. There is some finds of something like a port city in southwestern Kalimantan. We have Brunei. We have for today's Pontianak. Most cities, what is the remains we have start with Hinduistic temples or stuff that has to do with Indian ideology. Because Southeast Asians wouldn't build much in terms of a temple or so. They'd build a kind of marae, and that would be made mainly out of timber. So it would be lost in a jungle or under tropical conditions. Indian ideas must have come by sea. So Kalimantan, yes, there would sure be a chance. The Chinese often enough mention camphor, which is coming from Sumatra, but just the same from Kalimantan, from Borneo. If you have a product, you have a good chance, or you have really you should join one of these trade cycles. But once again, I personally would not think that many people the whole voyage all the way on one ship, or that one captain would risk his ship for the whole voyage all the way.
Okay, great. I think on that note, I'll bring this to a close. It's 8:20, just almost 8:25 here in Singapore, and I know it's a bit later for Natalie over in Sydney, so appreciate you staying with us. Yeah.